Mom doesn't understand anything anymore," my daughter Dana said, not even lowering her voice. I froze in the doorway. The grocery bag slipping from my hand. Apples scattered across the tile. One rolling until it stopped against my shoe. I didn't bend to pick them up. I just stood there, hollow and stunned, as if my own daughter had spoken my death aloud. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I arrived at the hospital early that morning. Before the halls remembered their purpose. Before the fluorescent lights started their buzzing complaints. The cleaning crew was just finishing. Their mop buckets squeaked down empty corridors. Water sloshed against plastic. Wheels clicked over tile seams. I preferred rooms this way. Quiet, neutral, not yet sharpened into weapons. Julian Reyes waited in the conference room. Young man, careful with his words, the kind who chose each syllable like stepping stones across deep water. His tie sat perfectly straight. His briefcase gleamed under the harsh lighting. My daughter Dana swept in exactly 3 minutes late. Navy suit pressed to perfection. Perfect posture. The smile she wore for hospital donors and difficult board meetings. She brought the smell of expensive perfume. The rustle of important papers. The energy of someone who managed things for a living. She spoke to Julian as if I were furniture. Said I wouldn't understand the complicated parts. Said they should keep things simple for me. Her voice carried across the room. Over my head. Around me. Never quite to me. I seated myself without help. Pulled the chair closer to the table. Folded my hands where they could see them. Julian slid papers toward me. A thick folder with my name typed across the top. Evelyn Park, 76 years old. Subject of today's business. He explained each document in his lawyer voice. Measured words. Careful pauses. Care directive. Financial guardianship. Authorization to sell my condo. Dana nodded along. Called it standard paperwork. Her voice bright as hospital lighting. Cheerful as a dental appointment. I read every word. Twice. Sometimes 3 times. The pages sounded harmless when spoken aloud. But printed on paper, they carved pieces from my life. My decisions. My keys. My signature floating without my hand attached. One clause named Dana as my primary agent. Empowered her to act if I became compromised in judgment. I touched that word with my fingertip. Compromised. Like a cracked foundation. Like a seam that had given way. Like something that needed tearing down. The paper felt smooth under my finger. Cold. Final. I asked Julian who would decide when I was compromised. He swallowed before answering. Adjusted his tie. The agent would decide. In consultation with a physician. So Dana would sign papers selling my home. Because Dana believed I was past believing. Dana would choose my care. Because Dana thought I had forgotten how to choose. My daughter exhaled through her nose. Made that sound mothers make when children ask inconvenient questions. The sound I had made when she was 5 and wanted to know why the sky was blue. She said I was being dramatic. Always making things complicated. Always needing more explanation than necessary. I removed my reading glasses. Cleaned them with my handkerchief. The cloth Arthur had given me 20 years ago. Took my time with each lens. I told her I mended things for a living. Had mended things for 40 years. Drama happened when people confused mending with tearing. When they reached for scissors instead of thread. Julian had prepared alternate documents. Most families preferred the consolidated version, he admitted. More efficient, cleaner. But he had separated papers if I wanted them. Different folders. Different choices. Different ways to slice my future. I signed the medical directive with my fountain pen. The one Arthur bought me for our anniversary. Left the property authorization untouched. Dana's jaw tightened like a seam pulled too tight. Her polished fingernails drummed the conference table. Pink polish. Perfect moons at each cuticle. The sound echoed in the sterile room. I stood up slowly. My knees protested but held. Placed my palm flat on the folder full of unsigned papers. Felt the weight of decisions unmade. Choices unclaimed. Looked directly into my daughter's eyes. Those brown eyes I had watched grow from curious to calculating. From open to closed. I told her I understood every single word in those documents. Every clause. Every implication. And I declined them on purpose. Then I walked out first. The hallway stretched long and wide ahead of me. Endless as a hospital nightmare. My footsteps echoed off the walls. Sharp sounds in the sanitized silence. Behind me, I heard Dana's voice rising. Heard Julian's measured responses. Heard the rustle of papers being shuffled and reshuffled. The sound of plans being rearranged. But I didn't turn around. Didn't slow down. Didn't explain myself further. I had spent 40 years hemming other people's clothes. Taking them in when they gained weight. Letting them out when they grew. Making them fit better. Adjusting waistbands for pregnant bellies. Shortening sleeves for aging arms. Mending tears from living. Now I was learning to make my own life fit again. The elevator doors closed with a soft whisper. I watched the floor numbers descend. 4, 3, 2, ground level. Watched myself in the polished metal reflection. An old woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun. A mouth still capable of saying no. Hands that remembered how to hold a pen. How to sign my name to papers I chose. The parking garage smelled of concrete and car exhaust. Oil stains and rubber. The underground scent of stored automobiles. My Honda sat exactly where I had left it. Blue paint faded but intact. Reliable. Unassuming. Still mine. I unlocked the door with my key. Not Dana's key. Not a key someone else controlled. Sat in the driver's seat for a moment. Let my hands rest on the steering wheel. Felt the familiar grooves worn by 40 years of driving. Driving myself to work. To the grocery store. To Arthur's doctor appointments. Home from his funeral. Remembered Arthur laughing when I pressed seams with the iron. "You tame fabric like it owes you rent," he used to say. His voice warm with affection. Maybe I was finally learning to tame something else. Something more important than hemlines. My own destiny. The papers in Julian's conference room would sit there unsigned. Dana would make phone calls to Victor. Victor would suggest legal strategies. They would discuss my stubbornness over dinner. But today, I had drawn a line. In black ink. In my own handwriting. A signature that meant something. A boundary that looked like my name at the bottom of only the documents I chose to sign. I started the engine. The familiar rumble of an old car that still ran. Backed out of the parking space slowly. Drove through the hospital district. Past the medical buildings. Past the pharmacies. Past the places where other people's children made decisions for them. Drove home to my condo that still smelled of lemon oil and thread. That still held Arthur's coffee cup in the sink. That still belonged to me. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. The condo welcomed me back with familiar silence. Lemon oil and thread. Those were the scents that greeted me. 40 years of careful living layered in the air. I had sown here through seasons and sorrows. Wedding hems for nervous brides. Choir robes for Sunday mornings. Uniforms taken in after winters of good stews. My old singer sat under its dust cover, sleeping like a calm animal, waiting for hands that knew its rhythm. I laid the unsigned papers on my dining table, spread them like a hand of cards I refused to play. Then I walked through my rooms, checking each corner like taking a patient's pulse, making sure everything still beat with my heartbeat. The mirror by the entry reflected back truth. An industrious woman with silver hair. A mouth that remembered both yes and no. Arthur had been gone 8 Septembers now. I could still hear his laughter echoing from the sewing room. "You tame fabric like it owes you rent," he used to say. His coffee cup still sat in the dish drainer. I had washed it this morning out of habit. Would wash it again tomorrow. Some routines were worth keeping. I made tea in my favorite cup. The one with the small chip on the handle. The flaw that made it mine. Stood at the balcony window watching my planters. Last spring's basil had grown leggy and wild, but the marigolds blazed stubborn and bright against October's approach. I thought about the words Dana's lawyer had used. Compromised in judgment. Each syllable scraped like an eraser across my name. First they speak around you. Then they speak for you. Then they write you out in clauses and subsections. I pulled a legal pad toward me. The yellow paper Arthur had bought in bulk. Always buying in bulk because it saved money. Wrote in block letters across the top what I choose. Under those words, in my neat dressmaker's script, I made a list. 1. Separate health decisions from money decisions. 2. Review any automatic transfers I had forgotten. 3. Leave the shop building to someone who remembered what hands were for. 4. Make my voice official before it was too late. 5. Be seen while I could still be heard. The shop building. My small storefront 2 neighborhoods away. Closed since the pandemic turned the world sideways. Now rented to a cobbler who paid late but paid. Who understood that some things were worth repairing. Dana called it underperforming real estate. I called it the room that had fed our family for decades. My phone buzzed against the table. A text from Dana asking about lunch. Wanting to go over what I didn't understand. I typed 3 different replies. Deleted each one. Set the phone screen down the way Mia always did. Better reception for actual life, my granddaughter said. 22 years old and already wiser than her mother. I rinsed my teacup in the sink. Dried it with the dish towel Arthur had brought back from our anniversary trip. Blue and white checks. Soft from years of use. Still sturdy where it counted. Found Arthur's old leather folio in the desk drawer. The one he used for important papers. Insurance documents. The deed to this place. Letters from his doctor. Slid the unsigned packet inside. Let the leather hold what I would not sign. I didn't feel bold standing there in my kitchen. Didn't feel brave or rebellious or any of the words Dana might use. I felt accurate, like a seam sewn straight and true. That would have to be enough. The afternoon light slanted through my windows. Golden and warm against the hardwood floors, Arthur had refinished himself. I remembered him on his knees with sandpaper and stain, taking his time to get each board perfect. You can't rush good work, he used to say. It shows when you try to hurry something that needs patience. Maybe that was what Dana didn't understand. She wanted to hurry my decisions, rush my choices, get the paperwork signed and filed away. But some things couldn't be hurried. Some things required the patience of measured consideration. I walked back to my sewing room. lifted the dust cover from my Singer. The machine gleamed dull silver in the afternoon light. Threaded it with white cotton. Basic. Reliable. The color I used for mending tears that needed to disappear. Found a pillowcase that had split along one seam. Nothing dramatic. Just the daily wear of being useful. Sat down at the machine. Placed my foot on the pedal. Let muscle memory guide the fabric under the needle. The familiar rhythm filled the room. Steady as a heartbeat. Purposeful as breathing. Each stitch pulled the edges back together. Made whole what had come apart. This was what I knew how to do. This was what my hands remembered. Mending. Repairing. Making things last longer than anyone expected. Outside, the city hummed with evening traffic. People driving home from work. From hospitals. From meetings where important papers got signed. But here in my sewing room, time moved at the speed of careful stitches. I finished the pillowcase. Held it up to check my work. The mend was nearly invisible. Strong enough to last through many more washings. Set it aside with the satisfaction of a job done right. The unsigned papers still waited on my dining table. Dana would call again tomorrow. Victor would suggest strategies over dinner. But tonight, I had drawn my lines in thread instead of ink. Shown myself I still knew how to fix what was broken. How to keep what mattered from falling apart. I covered the Singer again. Turned off the sewing room light. Left the machine ready for tomorrow's repairs. In the kitchen, I heated soup from a can. Ate standing at the counter like Arthur used to do when he was thinking. The condo settled around me with the small sounds of an old building. Pipes ticking. Floorboards sighing. The refrigerator humming its mechanical lullaby. All of it still mine. Still home. Still the place where I decided what happened next. I washed my bowl in the sink. Dried it with Arthur's checkered towel. Put it away in the cupboard where it belonged. Tomorrow I would call Julian about separating my affairs properly. Tonight I would sleep in my own bed. In the house that remembered who I used to be. And still knew who I was. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Mia arrived the way spring rain does. Tapping at my door. Laughing before I opened it. Slightly out of breath from climbing 3 flights. She worked 2 jobs and studied urban planning. Carried snacks like nourishment was a civic duty. Always thinking about feeding someone. I heard her key turning in my lock. The sound of someone who belonged here. Who had permission to enter my space. She called out that she'd brought lemon tarts. Not the grocery store ones with frosting that tasted like plastic. Real lemon. Made by the bakery near her apartment. I watched her move through my kitchen. Every cabinet door opened with confidence. She knew where I kept the good plates. The cloth napkins. The coffee that didn't taste like cardboard. She set 2 paper cups on my counter. Steam rising from the lids. The rich scent of beans roasted dark and honest. You always feed me, I told her. Watching her arrange the tarts like small golden suns on my grandmother's china. She laughed and said I always forgot to eat when I was plotting. Her voice warm with affection instead of accusation. Then she saw Arthur's leather folio on my dining table. The unsigned papers visible through the open flap. Her cheerfulness softened into something more careful. She asked how bad the meeting had been. I explained about the consolidated control. How I'd signed the medical part. Left my property decisions unsigned and untouchable. Mia perched on my kitchen stool. The same stool she'd used for homework 20 years ago. Her legs still didn't quite reach the floor. She said Dana meant well. Just thought of care as an itinerary to be managed. A schedule to be optimized and controlled. I told her I thought care meant being asked before the suitcase got packed. We stood there letting that truth settle between us. Two women who understood the difference between management and love. I wiped a crumb from my counter with my thumb. The gesture Arthur used to tease me about. Always tidying while talking. Then I asked if she remembered the shop's back room. Her eyes went soft with memory. The cutting table taller than her child self. The hook where Arthur kept his ridiculous fishing hat. The radio that only played 10 songs on endless rotation. She remembered all of it. The way children remember places where they felt safe. I told her I wanted that building to become what we'd always promised. A place where people could mend things and themselves. Classes for neighbors who'd forgotten how to fix what broke. Work tables for projects too big for kitchen counters. Open hours when anyone could come in from the cold. Not a banner with my name across the front. A key with hers attached. Mia blinked like I'd spoken in a language she almost understood. Asked if I meant her. I said she was the one who knocked before entering. Even when I was lost in my own quiet thoughts. Who brought lemon tarts instead of lectures? Her eyes shone with tears she didn't let fall. But she didn't reach for the folder. Didn't grab at the promise like it might disappear. She reached for my hand instead. Covered my fingers with hers. Her skin warm and alive and steady. Told me whatever I wanted, we'd do it right. Lawyers, notaries, all the proper paperwork to make it legal and lasting. I said we'd see Julian tomorrow. Make everything official while I still could. Then I told her something else. If the rest of them got loud about my decisions. If Dana and Victor raised their voices and made demands. Don't let their volume rewrite your map, I said. Don't let them convince you that loud equals right. Mia squeezed my hand once. Said sound couldn't move walls. Only hands could do that kind of work. We ate the tarts standing at my kitchen sink. Like conspirators who didn't owe the chairs any explanations. The pastry crumbled sweet and tart on my tongue. Real butter. Real lemon. The taste of someone who'd taken time to do things properly. Mia licked powdered sugar from her fingers. Asked if I was scared about what came next. I considered the question while I rinsed our plates. Let the warm water run over my hands. Told her I wasn't scared. Just tired of being managed by people who confused control with caring. She nodded like she understood. 22 years old and already wiser than her mother about some essential things. We moved to my living room. Sat on the couch Arthur had picked out 30 years ago. Still comfortable. Still sturdy in all the right places. Mia curled her legs under her. Asked what I remembered about teaching her to sew. I closed my eyes and saw her again. 6 years old. Chin resting on my cutting table. Watching me guide fabric under the singer's needle. How she'd hold her breath during the tricky parts. How she'd clap when a seam came out straight and true. The patience she'd shown even then. Waiting for her turn at the machine. Learning to thread needles without stabbing her fingers. She'd grown up in that back room. Learned that broken things could be made whole again. That careful hands could fix what seemed beyond repair. Maybe that was why she understood what I was trying to do now. Why she didn't argue with my unsigned papers. She knew the difference between mending and breaking. Between healing and managing. The afternoon light shifted across my living room carpet. Golden rectangles that moved like slow thoughts across the floor. Mia asked if I needed anything else today. Groceries. Errands. Phone calls to make. I told her I just needed her to remember this conversation. To hold on to what we'd promised each other. She said she would. Said she'd hold it safe until we could make it real. After she left, I sat in my quiet condo. Listened to the sounds of evening settling around me. Traffic humming 6 stories below. The elevator climbing up and down. Mrs. Chen next door running water in her kitchen sink. All the small sounds of people living their lives. Making choices. Deciding what came next. I picked up Arthur's folio. Carried it to my bedroom. Set it on the nightstand where I could see it. Tomorrow I would call Julian. Tomorrow I would make my promises legal and binding. Tonight I would sleep knowing I had chosen well. Had found someone who understood the weight of keys. Someone who brought lemon tarts instead of management plans. Who knocked before entering even my silences. The condo felt less like a patient waiting for treatment. More like a partner ready for whatever came next. I turned off the lights. Left tomorrow's plans resting in the dark. Ready to become real when the sun rose again. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Dana's hospital hosted a gala each fall. An evening of name tags and applause for people who wrote large checks. I was not on the guest list. Had never been on any guest list for these events. I learned the date from Mr. Cho in my building's lobby. His wife volunteered at the hospital. His wife discussed everything she learned there. The gala was tonight. Black tie optional. Dinner at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. I stood in my bedroom looking at dresses I hadn't worn in years. Chose the ink blue one from the back of my closet. The fabric still held its shape. Still remembered what it meant to be elegant. I pinned Arthur's tie clip to the neckline. Wore it as a brooch the way my mother had taught me. Let his memory dress me for battle. The Grand Metropolitan smelled of money and fresh flowers. Lilies arranged in crystal vases taller than children. I watched couples queue under chandeliers the size of dining room tables. Men in rented tuxedos. Women in dresses that cost more than my monthly groceries. I could have turned around. Walked back to my car. Driven home to my quiet condo. Instead, I went inside. The ballroom was designed to look generous. Round tables draped in cream linen. Centerpieces that blocked conversation. A stage where important people would make important speeches. I found Dana near the front. Shoulder to shoulder with donors whose names appeared on hospital wings. She wore her navy dress. The one that photographed well under flash bulbs. Her smile practiced and professional. Victor worked the room with his usual gravity. Shaking hands. Nodding at appropriate moments. Playing his role as the supportive spouse. Their son Ethan stood by a mirrored column. Checking his reflection every few minutes. Adjusting his tie. Smoothing his hair. I did not clear my throat. Did not announce myself with any flourish. I simply stepped into Dana's line of sight. Let her discover me the way morning discovers night. Her practiced smile caught like fabric on a nail. Snagged for just a moment before she refitted it. She said my name with forced brightness. Asked if Ethan had invited me to join them. I told her no. Said I had invited myself to this public event. A volunteer appeared with a clipboard. Searching for my name on lists that didn't contain it. I kept standing while they whispered among themselves. While they tried to solve the problem of my presence. Dana leaned close and spoke in her hospital voice. Said we could talk later. Said this wasn't the appropriate place. I replied that it was exactly the right place. Where she preferred me in photograph slides instead of actual rooms. Her jaw tightened the way it had in Julian's office. the way it always did when I refused to cooperate with her plans. She asked me not to make a scene, her voice barely above a whisper. I said I wasn't making anything. Wasn't doing anything dramatic or embarrassing. Standing was not a crime. The program began with speeches about healing and hope. Slides projected on screens showed the hospital's proud history. I recognized one image immediately. A seamstress repairing a volunteer's white coat. The hands in that photograph were mine. Taken 15 years ago when I still did alterations for hospital staff. When they still knew my name and what my fingers could accomplish. Now they celebrated the work while erasing the worker. Applauded the mending while forgetting who held the needle. I waited until the applause reached its peak. Until the room buzzed with self-congratulation. Then I leaned toward my daughter. Spoke directly into her ear so she couldn't pretend not to hear. Told her I was meeting with Julian tomorrow. That she could stop sending me those combined forms. Dana's hands clenched in her lap. Her knuckles went white against her dark dress. She hissed that I was making enemies for no good reason. Creating problems where none existed. I told her I was making boundaries for one excellent reason. For myself. For the woman whose hands they'd just celebrated without knowing her name. The dessert course arrived on china plates. Individual chocolate tarts with gold leaf that dissolved on the tongue. I stood before they could serve mine. Smoothed my ink blue dress. Adjusted Arthur's tie clip one final time. Dana grabbed my wrist as I turned to leave. Asked where I thought I was going. I looked down at her manicured fingers circling my arm. At the grip that tried to manage even my departure. Told her I was going home. To the condo she wanted to sell. To make phone calls she didn't want me making. Her grip loosened. Her hand fell back to her lap like a bird with broken wings. I walked through tables of people who didn't know my name. Past centerpieces that cost more than my monthly rent. The hotel lobby felt cooler than the ballroom. Less perfumed. Less desperate for approval. Outside, October air carried the bite of coming winter. Honest cold that didn't pretend to be anything else. I breathed until my lungs felt calibrated again. Until my heartbeat slowed to its normal rhythm. Walked to my Honda parked 3 blocks away. Between a pickup truck and a minivan owned by people who worked for their money. Sat in my car for a moment. Let the silence settle around me like a familiar coat. Remembered Arthur saying that some battles were won by showing up. By refusing to be erased from rooms where your presence made others uncomfortable. Tonight I had shown up. Had stood in my daughter's professional world wearing my own name like armor. Had reminded everyone that the hands in their historical photographs belonged to someone. Someone who still lived, still chose, still said no when no was the right answer. I started the engine. Drove through downtown streets lit by neon and ambition. Past restaurants where other families gathered for celebrations that included everyone. Past shops where merchants knew their customers' names. Drove home to my building where Mr. Cho would ask about my evening. Where Mrs. Chen would nod at me in the elevator. Where I belonged. Where my presence was welcome instead of managed. The condo smelled like lemon oil and the faint perfume from my blue dress. Like home. Like choices made by someone who still remembered how to choose. I hung the dress in my closet. Unpinned Arthur's tie clip. Set it on my dresser where I could see it tomorrow. A reminder that some accessories were inherited. That some armor was worn in memory of love. Tomorrow I would call Julian. Tonight I had reminded my daughter that I still existed. In rooms where she wished I didn't. At events where my presence complicated her careful presentations. I still existed, still chose my own invitations, still wore my own name like it meant something. Because it did. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Julian Reyes listened the way tailors measure. Precise. Without rush. Taking the dimensions of what I needed before cutting anything. His office smelled of leather-bound books and fresh coffee. Windows faced east, letting morning light pool across his desk like spilled cream. I told him I wanted a medical proxy that named Mia as alternate. Not primary. Dana could remain primary for emergencies because she knew the hospital. Knew which doctors to call and which forms to fill out. But treatment decisions should pass through more than one mind. Should require more than one signature. Julian typed notes on his computer. The keys clicked like small bones settling into place. Asked what I wanted to do about the property. I explained about the storefront on Carroll Street. How I wanted to create a community workshop trust. Mia as trustee. A board of 3 people who understood budgets and purpose. Julian smiled for the first time that morning. Said he knew a retired librarian who terrified grant writers. Someone who understood the difference between necessary expenses and wishful thinking. Perfect, I told him. Someone who would guard the money like a hawk guards her nest. I asked him to add a clause requiring unanimous consent for any sale. No backdoors. No emergency provisions that could be twisted into excuses. Julian's fingers moved across his keyboard, translating my words into legal language that would hold up in courts and contests. We established a separate personal trust for the condo. Beneficiary would be Mia. But I would retain what lawyers called a life estate. Meaning I stayed until I chose otherwise. Then I told him about one more thing. The automatic transfers I wanted to audit and terminate. Payments leaving my account each month for things I didn't remember authorizing. Bills that weren't mine. Expenses that had multiplied like weeds. At the bank, we sat across from a manager with a tie knotted too tight. His collar pressed white lines into his neck. He read from his computer screen. Voice growing quieter with each item he discovered. Recurring payments to Dana's household. Utilities I didn't use. Auto insurance for Ethan's car. Health club membership I'd never signed up for. Charity pledges made in my name. A vacation fund transfer labeled family enrichment. How enriching, I said softly, watching the manager's face flush pink above his starched collar. I instructed him to terminate everything permanently. Every automatic payment, every recurring transfer, every subscription I hadn't personally requested. Keep only one transfer active. A small monthly amount to Mia labeled studio lunches. The manager asked if I wanted to notify the recipients before the changes took effect. I told him no. Let the bank do what banks do best. Balance the books. Apply the rules equally. His fingers tapped across his keyboard like rain on a tin roof. Each keystroke canceling another piece of presumption. Back at Julian's office, we signed documents in a conference room with light that didn't hum. Natural brightness that made the papers seem more honest. The notary's stamp clicked each time it descended. Small sounds like the first stitch in a strong seam. Julian stacked the finished documents in neat piles. Originals in manila folders. Copies in matching envelopes. He told me I was decisive. Said most people took weeks to make choices this clear. I replied that I mended things before they tore completely. It saved thread, saved time, saved relationships that were worth preserving. He handed me a leather satchel containing everything we'd signed. Heavier than it looked but lighter than carrying other people's assumptions. I drove home through afternoon traffic. Past the hospital where Dana worked. Past the shops where Arthur and I used to buy groceries together. Past the building that housed my old storefront. Soon to be Mia's responsibility. Her chance to turn dreams into classes and community. The phone started ringing before I reached my front door. Dana's name flashing on the screen like a warning light. I let it ring. Let her voice spill into my answering machine while I made tea. Victor called next. Then Ethan. Their voices layering over each other in digital desperation. "Grandma, what the hell?" Ethan's text message said. His first communication in months reduced to confusion and blame. I put the phone in my kitchen drawer with rubber bands and recipe clippings. Things I kept but didn't need to see every day. They came to my building on Tuesday evening. I heard Victor's knock first. 2 firm raps meant to sound reasonable and unthreatening. He called through my door that we shouldn't be theatrical about this. That reasonable people could find reasonable solutions. I told him to come back when he preferred truth to tone. When he was ready to listen instead of manage. Dana tried next. Her voice sharper than Victor's. Called my behavior childish and unnecessary. I replied through the locked door that I was 76 years old. Had earned the right to choose my own adjectives. Their footsteps retreated down the hallway. Heels clicking against linoleum like distant typewriter keys. Then silence. Blessed quiet that let me hear my own thoughts again. Another knock came 20 minutes later. 3 hesitant taps instead of demanding pounds. I opened the door to find Ethan standing alone. Hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. Shoes new enough to suggest hope instead of habit. He said his mother wasn't okay. Said Mia had made me do things I didn't understand. I asked him to look at me instead of the floor. Really look. Did I appear to be someone easily made to do anything? He shook his head slowly. Studying my face like a map he'd never seen before. I asked when he'd last visited me without needing keys to something. Without wanting money for gas or textbooks or emergencies. His cheeks flushed red above his still soft jawline. Admitted he'd been busy with school and work and friends. I told him busy was a coat the lazy borrowed from people with real obligations. Then I softened my voice. Told him he was welcome in my home anytime. But only when he wanted me instead of my wallet. His eyes wavered between boy and man. Between the child who'd once helped me sort buttons and the stranger who'd learned to ask for things. He said he was sorry. The word barely audible above the hallway's fluorescent hum. I told him I wasn't collecting apologies. I was collecting visits. Real ones. Where we talked about more than money. He nodded. Then looked past me at my old singer visible through the living room doorway. Asked if that machine still worked after all these years. I smiled and told him it worked better than most speeches. Better than most promises people made with their mouths. Invited him inside to learn how to oil a machine that had outlasted 3 decades of daily use. We stood over the singer as it hummed itself awake. My hands showing his hands where to apply the oil. How to clean the bobbin case. How to thread the needle without fighting the tension. For 20 quiet minutes, my grandson remembered what his fingers were for. What his grandmother had always known about fixing things that seemed broken. The family was learning, slowly, one conversation at a time. One honest moment built on top of another. But they were learning, and that was enough for now. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Julian suggested a family meeting in his conference room. Neutral ground where chairs matched and water came with lemon slices. Where no one could claim home advantage. Dana arrived with her legal pad and 3 different pens. Victor carried his posture like expensive armor. Ethan kept his eyes on the carpet pattern like it held answers. Mia sat beside me, her pen capped, her notebook closed. She didn't need to take notes on what was already decided. Julian spoke first in his measured lawyer voice. Said that with my permission, he would summarize the documents we'd executed. Dana interrupted before he finished his first sentence. Said she needed to see originals of everything. Needed to verify what I'd signed. Julian remained unruffled as pond water. Told her she would receive copies. But first he would explain what her mother had chosen. The room went quiet except for the air conditioning's gentle hum. The sound of expensive silence. Julian outlined each document like reading a grocery list. Healthcare proxy with Dana remaining primary. Mia as alternate. Non-emergency decisions requiring discussion with both parties. Financial powers revoked from all prior agents. No exceptions. No emergency clauses. The Carroll Street storefront conveyed into a community workshop trust. Mia as trustee. Board of 3. Unanimous consent required for any sale. Personal residence trust established with Mia as beneficiary. Life estate reserved for me. Meaning I stayed until I chose to leave. Automatic transfers previously funding the Park household. Terminated permanently. Dana's pencil hadn't moved during Julian's entire summary. It sat motionless in her manicured fingers like a dead thing. She finally spoke. Called my decisions punitive and unnecessary. Said I was creating problems that didn't exist. I folded my hands on the polished conference table. Told her my choices were precise. Not punitive. Careful. Not careless. Victor interlaced his fingers and leaned forward. Suggested they could contest my mental capacity if necessary. Fight the documents in court. Julian's voice remained level as a carpenter's plane. Told Victor he was welcome to waste his money trying. But he should consider what he was contesting. My right to make informed decisions about my own property. The silence stretched like taffy between us. Sweet and sticky and increasingly uncomfortable. Dana turned to face me directly. Asked why I'd chosen Mia over her own daughter. Why I'd trusted a 22-year-old with decisions that affected the whole family. I met her gaze without flinching. Told her Mia knocked before entering. Had chosen care over control in small daily ways for years. Dana's mouth thinned to a line sharp enough to cut paper. Said she'd been protecting me from difficult decisions. Managing complex situations I couldn't handle alone. I replied that she'd been organizing me like a hospital department. Efficiently, effectively, but without asking what I wanted to be organized into. Ethan startled everyone by speaking. His voice cracked slightly like it still did when he was nervous. Said that maybe I was right about some things. That Mom did try to manage everything. Even things that belonged to other people. Dana stared at her son as if the room had suddenly grown new doors. As if familiar furniture had rearranged itself while she wasn't looking. Julian slid manila envelopes across the table. One for each family member. Told them these documents were binding and legal. Suggested they focus on being a family instead of fighting about signatures. No one reached for their envelope immediately. The manila rectangles sat like small bombs waiting to explode old assumptions. Then Mia uncapped her pen. wrote 2 words on her notepad large enough for everyone to see. Visit first. The words hung in the air like wisdom that shouldn't need speaking. Like truths so obvious they embarrassed everyone who'd forgotten them. Dana picked up her envelope. Held it without opening the flap. Her fingers traced my signature visible through the paper. Asked what she was supposed to do now. How she was supposed to help me if I wouldn't let her manage things. I told her to try visiting without an agenda. Coming by to drink tea instead of reviewing financial statements. Calling to ask about my day instead of my decisions. Victor cleared his throat. Said they'd been trying to do what was best for everyone involved. Trying to plan for contingencies I might not want to face. I said I understood their intentions. But intentions weren't the same as permission. Good motives didn't erase the need for consent. Ethan opened his envelope first. Read through the pages without commenting. Then looked up at me with something like recognition in his eyes. Said he hadn't realized how much I'd been paying for. How many of their expenses had been quietly covered by my accounts. Dana's cheeks flushed pink above her navy collar. Said those payments had been arrangements we'd all agreed to. Family helping family. I asked her when she'd last asked for my agreement. When she'd requested instead of assuming. When she'd checked before adding new charges to my automatic payments. The question sat in the room like an uninvited guest. Uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. Julian gathered his papers. Told us the legal work was finished. What happened next was up to us as people who shared blood and history. He stood and straightened his tie. Said he hoped we would remember that families worked best when everyone's voice got heard. Not just the loudest ones. Dana was the first to leave. She walked out with her envelope clutched against her chest. Her heels clicked down the hallway like a telegraph sending urgent messages. Victor followed with his usual diplomatic nod. Ethan lingered long enough to squeeze my shoulder. To whisper that he'd call me soon for another sewing machine lesson. Mia and I sat in the empty conference room. Surrounded by the ghosts of difficult conversations. The echoes of necessary truths. She asked if I felt good about what we'd accomplished. If the legal boundaries would hold against family pressure. I told her the papers would hold. They were written in language courts understood. Signed by witnesses who confirmed my mental clarity. But the real work would happen in smaller moments. In phone calls and visits. In whether Dana learned to ask instead of assume. We walked out of Julian's office into afternoon sunshine. The kind of light that made everything look possible again. I had drawn lines that would last longer than my lifetime. Had created structures that would protect Mia from the management that had nearly smothered me. The family would adjust or they wouldn't. They would learn to visit instead of manage. Or they would discover what absence felt like. Either way, I had chosen. Had made my voice official while it still carried the strength of conviction. Had remembered who I was before other people started deciding who I should become. That was enough. That was everything. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. 6 weeks wore themselves into the calendar like familiar patterns. October became November. November prepared for winter's sharp arrival. The marigolds in my balcony planters went brittle and brown. The basil remembered who it used to be before frost touched its leaves. I deadheaded the spent flowers. Saved seeds in small envelopes labeled with careful handwriting. Next spring's promises tucked into paper pockets. The workshop's lease transferred to the trust without drama. Legal papers signed in triplicate. Filed in offices that smelled of dust and permanence. Mrs. Hahn arrived for our first board meeting. The retired librarian Julian had recommended. She brought homemade cookies and a spreadsheet that made Mia's eyes widen with respect. Mrs. Hahn understood budgets the way I understood seams. Where to reinforce. Where to allow flexibility. Where to cut without damaging the whole structure. She asked pointed questions about utilities and insurance. About liability and permits. About the difference between dreams and sustainable business plans. I liked her immediately. Someone who counted cookies and pennies with equal precision. Mia drafted a class schedule on yellow legal paper. Mending Mondays for basic repairs. Open tables on Wednesday afternoons. Saturday morning hemline hotline for emergency alterations. She designed flyers on her laptop. Simple black text on cream paper. No fancy graphics. Just information about when and where people could learn to fix things. The first students arrived on a gray Thursday morning. Mrs. Patterson from down the street with a winter coat whose zipper had given up. Mr. Rodriguez with work pants that needed hemming after he'd lost 20 pounds. A young mother brought her daughter's torn ballet costume. Pink tulle that had caught on something sharp. The little girl watched me thread the needle with eyes wide as saucers. I showed them how to approach each repair. Where to begin. Which tools worked best. How to make invisible mends that would outlast the original seams. People brought more than clothes to my workshop. They brought stories attached to fabric. The jacket that had belonged to a father. The curtain that wanted to become a tablecloth. The satin dress that remembered a wedding day 40 years past. I listened to their stories while my hands worked. While needles pulled threads through memories made visible. Dana did not call during those 6 weeks. She sent one email that I printed and filed under attempts at communication. The message began with an apology perched on the word if. Said she was sorry if I felt misunderstood. If I had interpreted her actions as controlling rather than caring. I folded the email and placed it in my filing cabinet. Between tax receipts and warranty information. Things that might matter someday but didn't require immediate attention. Victor sent a single text message. A thumbs up emoji after Ethan visited twice without asking for money. His digital approval of progress he hadn't contributed to making. Ethan surprised me by showing up on a rainy Sunday. Brought pastries shaped like crescent moons and questions about how the singer's tension mechanism worked. He swept sawdust from the workshop floor while I oiled moving parts. Asked if I missed sewing for money instead of teaching. I told him I still sewed for payment. Just different currency now. Paid in the look a coat gave when it fit its owner properly again. He helped me arrange chairs in a circle for Monday's class. Asked why I'd never taught him to sew when he was younger. I said he'd never asked. Had been too busy with video games and soccer practice to sit still long enough for needle threading. But he was asking now. Sitting still now. Learning patience one careful stitch at a time. Mia brought lunch to the workshop most afternoons. Soup in thermos containers. Sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Coffee that didn't taste like it had been filtered through cardboard. We ate sitting on overturned milk crates. Watching afternoon light discover the floor in slow rectangular progressions. She showed me photographs she'd found in my old files. Pictures of the shop when Arthur was still alive. When customers lined up on Saturdays for alterations and repairs. One image made us both pause. Me at the cutting table. Mia as a child watching from her designated chair. Chin resting on folded arms. eyes following every movement of my scissors. She wanted to hang that photograph on the workshop's brick wall. Let everyone see who had taught us that broken things could be made whole again. I told her to hang it crooked. Let the room correct it over time. Let the students straighten it when they noticed it needed adjusting. We laughed together. The soft laugh of people who understood each other's shorthand, who shared tools and table space and the satisfaction of work done right. The workshop filled with voices during evening hours. People comparing techniques, sharing stories of repairs that had lasted decades, trading phone numbers and coffee dates. I watched from my corner. Saw community growing around shared needles and borrowed thimbles, around the simple act of fixing what was broken instead of throwing it away. Mrs. Chen from my building brought a quilt her grandmother had stitched. Intricate patterns coming apart along stress points. Stars and flowers losing their geometric precision. We spread it across 3 tables. Studied where original threads had weakened. Where new reinforcement could extend its life by another generation. The work took 4 Saturday mornings. 8 hands working together. Mrs. Chen teaching us about traditional Chinese knots while I showed her American quilting techniques. When we finished, the quilt looked like itself again. Stronger in places where repairs had been necessary. More beautiful for having been tended by multiple generations of careful fingers. On a blue-edged December morning, I pinned a note to my corkboard. Handwritten on index card stock. Keep the door unlocked for love. Bolted for entitlement. Arthur would have teased me about the poetry. Then he would have helped me tape it straighter. But the sentiment would have made him proud. The workshop full of people learning what their hands could accomplish. What patience and thread could mend. I stood in the doorway watching my students bend over their projects. Concentrating, creating, connecting with each other through shared frustration and small victories. This was what I had chosen instead of management. Community instead of control. Teaching instead of being managed. The city breathed around us. Indifferent and faithful. Full of people who needed to learn that broken things could be fixed. That hands were capable of more than spending and signing. That some repairs took time. Some mending required patience. Some healing happened one careful stitch at a time. I didn't wait for others to remember me anymore. I was too busy remembering myself. Too busy teaching others to remember what their own hands were capable of creating. The door stayed open. The light stayed on. The singer hummed its steady rhythm. Ready for whatever needed mending next. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Spring arrived early that year. February brought warm afternoons that fooled the bulbs into believing winter had finished its work. I planted seeds in my balcony containers. Marigolds and basil. The same faithful companions that had weathered seasons with me before. The workshop had found its rhythm by then. Students who came for basic repairs stayed to learn advanced techniques. Strangers became neighbors over shared spools of thread. Mrs. Han kept our books balanced with the precision of someone who'd managed library budgets for 30 years. Every penny accounted for. Every expense justified. Mia had grown into her role as trustee. Made decisions with the careful consideration I'd taught her. Asked questions before assuming answers. She hired 2 part-time instructors. A young man who specialized in leather repair. An older woman who knew secrets about vintage fabric that most people had forgotten. The workshop stayed busy 6 days a week. Closed Sundays so everyone could rest. so hands could recover from the good tiredness that came from useful work. I taught Tuesday morning basics, Thursday afternoon advanced techniques, Saturday workshops for children whose parents wanted them to know what fingers could accomplish besides typing. 8-year-old Emma brought a stuffed elephant with a split seam. Batting leaked from its belly like soft snow. She cried when she saw the damage. I showed her how to make tiny stitches, how to hide the mend so no one would know her elephant had been hurt, how repairs could make things stronger than they'd been before. Her smile when she finished could have powered the building's lights for a week. Dana finally called on a Thursday in March, her voice careful as someone walking across ice that might crack. She asked if we could meet for coffee. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere that wouldn't feel like territory belonging to either of us. I suggested the diner on 5th Street. 4 mica tables and coffee that remembered what coffee was supposed to taste like. No pretensions. No agendas hidden behind fancy names. She arrived 5 minutes early. Sat facing the door like someone expecting trouble. Her purse clutched against her side like armor. I ordered black coffee. She asked for decaf with artificial sweetener. We sat across from each other like diplomats from countries that shared a border but not a language. She apologized first. Not the conditional sorry from her email. A real apology that acknowledged specific mistakes. Specific assumptions she'd made without permission. Said she'd been managing me the way she managed hospital departments. Looking for efficiency instead of understanding what I actually needed. I stirred my coffee and listened. Let her words settle between us like dust motes finding places to land. Told her I understood her intentions. Had always understood them, but intentions weren't the same as consent. Good motives didn't erase the need to ask first. She nodded and twisted her wedding ring. A gesture Arthur used to make when he was working through difficult thoughts. Said Ethan had been visiting the workshop. Learning to repair clothes instead of throwing them away. Coming home with stories about patient hands and careful work. Said Victor thought maybe they could find a way to be family without being managers. Without making assumptions about what help looked like. I sipped my coffee and watched her face. Saw glimpses of the daughter who'd once helped me sort buttons by color. Who'd sat at my kitchen table doing homework while I mended her school clothes. That daughter was still there. Buried under years of professional efficiency and the belief that managing meant caring. I told her she could visit the workshop anytime. Could learn alongside the other students. Could remember what her own hands knew about creating instead of just organizing. She asked if I would consider Sunday dinners again. Family meals without business discussions. Without papers that needed signing or decisions that required immediate attention. I said I would consider it. If dinner meant conversation instead of management. If Sunday meant rest instead of strategy sessions. She reached across the table and touched my hand. Her fingers warm against my knuckles. The first unprofessional contact we'd shared in months. Said she missed her mother. Had been missing her for longer than she'd realized. Had confused protecting me with controlling me until she couldn't see the difference anymore. I left my hand under hers. Let the contact bridge the distance we'd both created. Let touch say what words hadn't quite managed to express. The diner hummed with afternoon conversations. Other families working through their own complicated territories. Other people learning to navigate love without losing themselves in the process. We parted with a tentative hug. Her arms careful around my shoulders. My embrace warm enough to suggest possibility without promising more than time would allow. I drove home through neighborhoods where spring was announcing itself in small ways. Crocuses pushing through sidewalk cracks. Trees beginning to remember their summer shapes. The workshop was busy when I arrived. A dozen people bent over projects that mattered to them. Repairing jackets and relationships. Mending clothes and connections. Mia looked up from the industrial surger she'd been learning to operate. Asked how the coffee with Dana had gone. I told her it was a beginning. Not a solution. Not a guarantee. But a place to start building something more honest than what we'd had before. That evening I sat on my balcony watching the city settle into twilight. Cars carrying people home to dinners and conversations. Lights coming on in windows that held their own stories. My phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. A photo of the jacket he'd repaired in yesterday's class. His stitches weren't perfect, but they were his. Done with his own hands at his own pace. The message said he was proud of the work. Proud of learning something his grandmother had tried to teach him years ago when he'd been too impatient to listen. I typed back that the stitches looked strong. That strong was more important than perfect. That he was learning what mattered most about any repair work. The marigold seeds I'd planted were already showing green shoots. Small promises pushing toward light. Reminders that growth happened on its own schedule. That patience produced better results than force. I covered the singer for the night. Turned off the workshop lights. Locked the door that would open again tomorrow for people who needed to learn what their hands could accomplish. The condo welcomed me with familiar scents. Lemon oil and the ghost of thread. Coffee and the lingering warmth of a day spent in useful work. I made tea in Arthur's favorite mug. The one with the chip that made it specifically ours. Sat at the kitchen table where he used to read newspapers while I planned the next day's repairs. The unsigned papers Dana had brought months ago were still filed in Arthur's folio. Evidence of a choice that had changed everything. A refusal that had made room for something better. Tomorrow would bring new students. New tears that needed mending. New opportunities to teach patience and precision to hands that had forgotten their own capabilities. Tonight I sat in my chosen quiet. Surrounded by things I'd decided to keep. In the home that still belonged entirely to me. The city breathed around me. Full of people learning their own lessons about control and care. About the difference between managing and loving. I had drawn my lines. Made my choices. Created something lasting from the space where I'd refused to be managed. That was enough. That was everything. That was exactly what hands were for.